The fall of Donald Trump's real estate empire in New York does not represent merely the collapse of a family corporate structure, but signals the definitive bankruptcy of a power model based on perception and the elasticity of accounting truth. We are witnessing the moment when state authority ceases to be an abstract threat and manifests as material execution against the concrete of Fifth Avenue. This dismantling process proves that the shield of insolvency and the dilatory maneuvers that sustained the brand for decades have reached an impassable systemic limit in the face of contemporary transparency metrics. What is unfolding in Manhattan is the strategic deconstruction of a symbol of 20th century capitalism, revealing that political capital is utterly incapable of protecting physical capital when the architecture of fraud is exposed by the judicial engine in a definitive and material way. To understand the magnitude of the current asset seizure, it is necessary to go back decades and analyze the long-standing symbiosis between the Trump Organization and the New York financial ecosystem. During the 1980s and 90s, the company operated under a logic of aggressive growth, where asset values were frequently shaped by the strength of the brand rather than by traditional accounting metrics alone. This period of unbridled expansion consolidated a corporate culture that viewed state regulation as an obstacle to be bypassed through subjective valuations and constant renegotiations. What we see today is not an isolated event, but the culmination of a historical friction between a personalist business method and the compliance structures that have become increasingly rigid in the global market. The transition from threat to execution marks the end of an era of impunity based on social prestige and media influence. The financial architecture built around luxury properties in Manhattan has always depended on a perception of solidity that allowed access to massive loans with preferential interest rates. Over time, the divergence between the values reported to the state for tax purposes and the values presented to banking institutions created a systemic distortion that the New York judiciary began to investigate with a surgical lens. This practice, once seen as a real estate industry shrewdness, was reclassified under the lens of systematic civil fraud, transforming what was once a market strategy into a lethal legal liability. The current institutional fragility of the United States only intensifies the gravity of the scenario, as the dismantling process occurs on a battlefield where the rigorous application of the law is interpreted simultaneously as necessary justice and as an instrument of political power. The impact of this scenario goes beyond individual financial losses and hits the core of the institutional credibility of the high-end commercial real estate market. The New York justice system, by advancing to the stage of material execution, signals that dilatory appeals and strategic insolvency maneuvers have reached their limit of effectiveness against the pressure for absolute transparency. The paradigm shift is clear. The business model that thrived in the shadows of private valuations now faces the cold light of public scrutiny and direct state intervention. It is not just about punishing an individual, but about a demonstration of strength by the legal bureaucratic apparatus against family corporations that operated outside contemporary standards of governance. This clash redefines the limits of property rights when they come into direct conflict with the obligations of financial probity required for economic stability. Furthermore, the transition from a defensive narrative to the reality of physical asset seizure reveals the exhaustion of corporate protections that previously seemed impregnable. The dismantling of physical properties symbolizes the breaking of an implicit social contract between the business elite and regulators, where wealth and fame served as buffers against the most severe legal consequences. By focusing on material execution, the state strips the empire of its aura of invincibility, forcing a direct confrontation with the liquidity and operational viability of the company's remnants. The scenario is one of deep technical complexity, where every judicial decision acts as a lever that destabilizes decades of financial engineering. This historical moment is the peak of an institutional cleaning process that seeks to realign the New York market with global transparency requirements, sacrificing the most emblematic names of its urban landscape. The central conflict defining this historic development lies in the head-on clash between the absolute sovereignty of the judiciary and the strategic resilience of a brand that operated above conventional liquidity norms. On one side, the New York legal system demands billion-dollar financial guarantees and immediate liquid assets as a counterpart to civil fraud convictions, acting as an implacable collection engine. On the other side, the Trump Organization finds itself trapped in a capital structure composed mostly of illiquid assets, such as skyscrapers and golf courses, which cannot be converted into cash without a catastrophic devaluation. If you value deep analysis of power and systems, subscribe to the channel to follow the upcoming chapters of this fall. This disparity between the nominal value of assets and the capacity for immediate conversion reveals the systemic breaking point where the empire finally collides with mathematical reality. The tension is further aggravated by the actions of creditors and financial institutions, who observe the process with analytical caution, ready to trigger cross-default clauses should total insolvency be formalized. This pole of the conflict highlights that market confidence, once sustained by Donald Trump's image of infallible success, is now fragmented by the material execution of seizure orders. The judiciary acts not only as an arbiter, but as an executor that defines liquidation priorities, ignoring the nuances of private management in favor of public reparation. What is at stake is not just the possession of a specific property, but the future viability of a legal entity that has lost its capacity for financial self-management. The dispute, therefore, ceases to be a legal debate to become a desperate struggle for the survival of an economic ecosystem that sustained decades of political and business influence. At the epicenter of this confrontation, the figure of political martyrdom is used as a narrative layer of defense, but it finds little resonance in the debt execution spreadsheets. The strategy of transforming business failure into capital of persecution seeks to maintain the loyalty of the electoral base, while the civil system methodically dismantles the financing infrastructure of the Trump Organization. The conflict signals that the use of the civil system to neutralize an adversary's power base is a precision tool, capable of hitting economic foundations where political rhetoric cannot reach. As deadlines expire, the reality of forced sales in judicial auctions imposes a verdict that the luxury market processes with absolute pragmatism. It is a war of attrition where the state authority holds time and the law, while the private brand holds only the echoes of a glory that the concrete can no longer sustain. The trigger for this collapse was the judicial determination that the Trump Organization systematically inflated asset values to secure favorable loans from various financial partners. This sentence did not just impose a fine, it established a legal fact that compromised the integrity of the company's entire financial history and internal record-keeping. By proving that properties were overvalued by hundreds of millions, the court invalidated the relationship of trust between the borrower and the banking system. This movement reveals how the legal mechanism can dismantle the logic of a private empire by attacking its primary source of survival: credit. The implications are immediate, as every contract signed under these premises becomes a potential liability for the company. The state's legal victory signals the end of a cycle where real estate valuations were marketing tools, now forcing a brutal return to the economic reality. The next stage in this chain of events was the technical impossibility of securing a bond for the astronomical value of the judgment. The magnitude of the penalty created a liquidity vacuum that traditional insurers were unwilling or unable to fill, given the high risk of total loss. This phase of the crisis suggests that the financial safety net, which generally protects billionaires from immediate execution, has clear limits when the scale of fraud is perceived as systemic. The inability to deposit the guarantee acted as a catalyst, moving the process from the sphere of legal debate to the reality of imminent material seizure. Without the protection of a judicial stay, the empire was left exposed to direct intervention by the New York Attorney General's office. This failure to secure financial guarantees evidences a deep isolation of the brand within the global banking market. With the expiration of the bond deadlines, the immediate seizure order was issued, authorizing the state to begin the inventory of physical assets. This moment marks the transition from psychological threat to administrative reality, where the Attorney General gains the power to freeze bank accounts and begin the takeover of iconic buildings. The process signals a profound change in the power balance, as the state no longer waits for voluntary payment but actively seeks value in the concrete of the towers. Every judicial petition for the seizure of a property implies a direct attack on the logistical and operational continuity of the Trump Organization. The strategy adopted by the judiciary is surgical, targeting the most liquid or prestigious assets first to maximize the impact of recovery. This progression shows that the legal system is prepared to methodically dismantle the structure of the empire. The seizure of a primary asset triggers a devastating financial domino effect through the cross-default clauses present in most commercial mortgage contracts. When a central building enters the judicial foreclosure process, other creditors may accelerate their own collections, fearing the total insolvency of the group. This chain reaction reveals the fragility of a business model built on high leverage and the interconnection of brand prestige. The erosion of liquidity in one sector of the company inevitably contaminates other arms of the organization, creating a debt spiral that escapes the controller's command. This phenomenon highlights that the structural architecture of the Trump Organization was not designed to withstand a simultaneous attack on multiple fronts. The resulting instability suggests that the loss of a single major property could lead to the systemic collapse of the entire real estate portfolio. The subsequent phase involves the appointment of judicial receivers to manage properties during the forced liquidation process. This intervention removes the Trump family from the strategic control of their own assets, transferring decision-making power to external entities focused on transparency. If you seek to understand the hidden gears of power and big finance, subscribe now so you don't miss our next investigations. Such an administrative change reveals the depth of the company's loss of sovereignty, as the brand is no longer managed by its creator, but operated by state agents. The receivership ensures that the income generated by the buildings is redirected to fulfill the judgment, depriving internal operations of cash flow. This technical stage signals the transformation of a private symbol into a monitored public asset, where every profit is rigorously audited and seized for legal restitution. Finally, the material dismantling leads to the symbolic erosion of the brand, manifested in the physical removal of the Trump name from the facades of confiscated buildings. This act represents much more than an aesthetic change. It is the visual confirmation of the fall of an intangible asset that dominated the global imagination for decades. The removal of the gold letters implies a terminal devaluation, where the surname becomes a legal liability instead of a commercial magnet for new business. As properties are sold at auction to new owners, the Trump era in New York real estate reaches its definitive conclusion. This physical and symbolic transition evidences the end of the cult of personality as a sustainable business strategy in the high-end market. The result is a scenario where the concrete remains, but the power that gave it identity is systematically erased by the state. The visible layer of this phenomenon presents itself as the financial downfall of a billionaire who, after decades of ostentation, succumbs to the weight of unpayable judicial fines. For the average observer, it is a classic narrative of a fall, where justice finally catches up with someone who thought they were above it through monetary penalties and loss of physical wealth. On this surface, the event is interpreted as a clear personal and business defeat, marked by the exhaustion of resources and the inability to honor legal commitments. The image of Donald Trump being symbolically evicted from his own buildings serves as a dramatic conclusion for the public following the case through headlines. However, this surface perception ignores the deeper gears operating behind the takeover of each asset, treating the seizure only as a direct accounting consequence without considering the systemic implications of the intervention. Under a strategic lens, the seizure represents the deliberate use of the civil system to dismantle the power infrastructure of a high-profile international political adversary. By removing the funding base and the image of business success, the judicial apparatus neutralizes the resource mobilization capacity that sustained Trump's influence behind the scenes. This analytical layer reveals that the material execution of assets functions as a precision surgical tool designed to suffocate the financial logistics that allowed for the operation of campaigns and expansion projects. The strategic intent goes beyond value recovery. It seeks the disarticulation of a system of influence that used real estate wealth as collateral for political capital. Thus, the dismantling of properties acts as a form of institutional interdiction, removing the economic pillars upon which the former president's narrative of invincibility was carefully constructed and maintained over many years. From a macroeconomic perspective, the dismantling of the Trump real estate empire signals a profound reconfiguration in the trust patterns of the Manhattan market and the global financial system. The end of the brand premium over accounting reality reflects a systemic trend of regulatory hardening against business models based on subjective and opaque valuations. However, this structural change manifests sharply in micro-events, such as the direct intervention at the 40 Wall Street building. At this specific point, the appointment of a judicial receiver transformed the daily management of an architectural icon into an exercise in forced transparency and constant public scrutiny. Every lease signed and every operational expense authorized ceased to be sovereign family decisions and became records audited by the state. This movement between the collapse of an economic paradigm and the technical bureaucracy of a building illustrates the precision of the dismantling. At the micro level of judicial actions, the Attorney General's decision to file judgment notices in specific counties, such as Westchester, evidences a meticulously planned territorial siege strategy to hit properties like the Seven Springs estate. This procedural detail, though it may seem like a minor technicality, represents the moment when legal authority intercepts property rights in their most tangible and personal form. This localized pressure generates a macro effect that echoes throughout the legal architecture of the United States, establishing a severe precedent for large-scale family corporations. The system demonstrates that the complexity of corporate structures no longer serves as an impassable barrier against the application of civil fraud law. The alternation between blocking an individual deed and redefining corporate governance reveals how the state uses targeted events to consolidate a new systemic reality, where accountability is absolute and unavoidable for everyone. The economic implications of the Trump Organization's asset seizure resonate immediately in the New York commercial real estate market, creating a climate of uncertainty among high-end investors. The possibility of a forced sale or fire sale of iconic assets like Trump Tower and the Wall Street building creates deflationary pressure in areas where market values are traditionally stable. If major properties are liquidated quickly to meet judicial judgments, the price benchmark for luxury buildings in the region could suffer a severe correction, affecting the portfolios of other major developers. This scenario reveals the fragility of a market that depends on the perception of legal stability to maintain its valuations. The impact transcends Trump's individual wealth, signaling a phase of volatility for Manhattan real estate, where the risk of state intervention must now be priced into every future transaction of this scale. In the political arena, the dismantling of the business empire is quickly converted into fuel for a narrative of institutional persecution, strengthening the loyalty of Donald Trump's electoral base. The event is presented not as a consequence of accounting fraud, but as a deliberate attempt by the system to neutralize a candidate through non-electoral means. This transformation of corporate bankruptcy into political martyrdom creates a paradox. While the traditional financing infrastructure of the Trump organization is dismantled, the political capital derived from popular indignation may grow significantly. However, in the long run, the loss of financial liquidity imposes severe restrictions on the logistics of future campaigns and the ability to maintain a global network of influence. The material weakening of the successful billionaire figure challenges the effectiveness of this narrative among moderate voters, altering the power balance within the current American political landscape. From a legal standpoint, the case establishes a severe and transformative precedent for how large family corporations must report their assets to the state and financial institutions. The rigorous application of civil fraud laws against a figure of such high-profile signals that the era of creative valuations and accounting opacity in the real estate sector has come to an end. This development forces a stricter standardization of governance, where executive responsibility for valuation discrepancies is monitored with a level of rigor previously reserved only for publicly traded companies. Banking institutions and insurers, anticipating new rounds of regulatory scrutiny, are likely to tighten their credit criteria for entities with excessively centralized power structures. The legacy of this process will be a more vigilant legal architecture, capable of intervening preemptively to ensure that the declared solidity of an empire actually matches its financial reality. One of the main turning points in this narrative lies in the break from the historical pattern of resilience that Donald Trump demonstrated over 4 decades of litigation and financial crises. In the past, the businessman utilized the bankruptcy system and dilatory appeals as a strategic shield, transforming technical retreats into new opportunities for financing and brand expansion. However, the current scenario presents a definitive contrast, as the initiative for action no longer belongs to the debtor, but to the state apparatus operating under a logic of immediate and irreversible material execution. This change in direction reveals that the traditional survival mechanisms of the empire have reached a point of saturation, where the flexibility of private negotiations has been replaced by the rigidity of judicial warrants. The legal system, by ignoring the defendant's aura of untouchability, has imposed an economic realism that destabilizes the organization. Another fundamental contrast emerges in the transition of the Trump surname from a marketing asset to a paralyzing legal liability within the real estate market. For years, the brand functioned as a value multiplier, allowing properties to be marketed as icons of exclusivity and economic power. However, the dismantling process introduces a value inversion, where the presence of the brand attracts a level of state scrutiny that renders new investments and institutional partnerships unfeasible. While Trump's public narrative attempts to sustain the image of prosperity under attack, the reality of seizure notices signals that the intangible value of the name has been eroded by the exposure of civil fraud. This turning point indicates that the architecture of perception, which once sustained the empire, has lost its effectiveness against the concreteness of judicial auctions. The result is the demystification of a power that depended entirely on illusions. The dismantling of the Trump empire in New York transcends mere asset liquidation to consolidate itself as a landmark of institutional supremacy over facade capitalism. Throughout this analysis, it has become evident that the collision between judicial authority and the Trump organization was not an accident, but the inevitable result of a system that finally found the exact pressure point where political capital becomes useless against material execution. The deconstruction of the perception architecture that sustained the brand reveals a profound strategic lesson about the nature of contemporary power. The image of solidity is a volatile asset that dissolves in the face of the transparency demanded by global metrics. What remains is not just a fragmented heritage, but proof that the justice system possesses the technical capacity to disarticulate influence structures that previously seemed unreachable by common civil law in the United States. For the near future, projections indicate that the luxury real estate scenario will undergo a rigorous adjustment, where corporate governance will become the main valuation criterion, overriding the weight of personalist names. The Trump Organization, now stripped of its most iconic landmarks, will face a long phase of financial ostracism, limited by operational restrictions that make any attempt at rapid restructuring virtually impossible. This legal precedent will function as a sword of Damocles over other family corporations that operate in the shadow of subjective valuations, forcing a systemic realignment with demands for accounting compliance. The fall of the empire sets the standard for a new era of state vigilance, where ownership is a right conditioned on absolute observance of the public norm. Understanding this phenomenon is essential to see how the gears of law will shape future power disputes between the state and the global elite.